I guess our space really isn't any different than any other situation, except we have the added emotional side of it. And I'd say, what's the quote? And I forget the person who it's attributed to, but society is judged on how they treat their dead. I think that to the core is true. We perform a service that every single human being on this planet is going to need. And is there value in that, or is funeral service turning into nothing but waste disposal? I don't think it will ever be just waste disposal, but I don't know that funeral service profession as it is today or as it was in 1960 is going to be anything close to what it becomes in 2040 or 2075.
Welcome to the Direct Cremation Podcast with your hosts, Tyler Yamasaki and Will DeMichaelis. Today's guest has spent the last 26 years immersed in cremations, from understanding how to run and operate the crematory all the way to marketing to and arranging with the family. He is an expert when it comes to running an effective cremation company. He is a former member of the board of directors of CANA, former editor-in-chief of the Cremationist, a cremation coach with ICCFA, a past member of the National Funeral Directors Association Exhibitor Advisory Committee, and was formerly a trustee and past president of the executive board of the NFDA Heritage Club. He is also a certified celebrant and the founder of Raven Plume Consulting. Please welcome Larry Stuart Jr. Welcome, Larry.
Thanks, guys. That was a great bio. It actually just makes me feel really old.
Well, I tried to get some of the highlights, but I know that you've done so much more in death care. I wanted to condense it. I don't want to talk for 10 minutes on your intro.
No, please don't.
But can you maybe give us the highlights of your journey in the past 26 years of death care?
Sure. I started even before that. My father was the operations manager, and his best friend was the owner of All Crematory back in the very late 70s when I was still in high school. Yeah, I'm that old. And I always thought it was intriguing, but I never really wanted to work in the space. And so, I graduated from high school, went to college, got a degree. Dad basically said, you've got to go find your way and get some foundation under you before you're even going to, because I was one of those kids, I wanted it all right away. And, Dad was, kind of a big fish in a very, very little fishbowl, if you will. And, he left all in 1995 to start CMS, Crematory Manufacturing and Service, and dragged me along with him at that point. And I realized very quickly that I really like the space. And it's not just the cremation and equipment servicing and manufacturing part of it, the business part of it, the marketing part of it. It's just the impact that funeral service in general has on people. And I know that sounds cheesy, but I always felt that we do a lot more than just the average accountant or lawyer. We really do take care of the living and the dead simultaneously. And I just find that really kind of rewarding. So I sold CMS 7 years ago and started cremation strategies and consulting, and realized very quickly that cremation wasn't everything, if you will. People wanted more. They wanted HR help. They wanted, embalming technique help. They wanted, how do I arrange a funeral with a millennial? Well, I didn't know any of that stuff. So I brought some other people on, and, now I have other consultants that specialize and have different competencies than me. And, we can basically help funeral professionals. And it's what our purpose is to serve more families better. And brings us to today. 26 plus years later.
Yeah, I was on your website and I see that Raven Plume offers many different consulting services, not just in a specific area, that cross the span of all types and all parts of the funeral business. So maybe we can break this question down by different categories. Starting with operations, what are the most common mistakes you see in the operations of the funeral home?
Oh gosh, the operation of the funeral home, gaps in chain of custody, gaps in identification protocols. We live in such a litigious society, and it's not that we think we're going to make mistakes. We'll make mistakes, but especially with cremation, if if you are accused of making a mistake, cremating the wrong body, you don't have a way to prove that you did. There's no DNA in cremated remains. And the only thing you have is your word, which who's going to believe you when a jury is looking at a bereaved family in a, horrible funeral home or crematory? So documentation and process and procedures and consistency across all of that is the biggest thing I see in firms, especially the small firms. I have a client years ago that said, Larry, we don't need to do ID and chain of custody. We know everyone we bury. And right off the bat, I'm like, okay, well, let's look at that phrase. And he understood after I explained to him that it's not about you making the mistake. It's about proving that you didn't to somebody. And, even if you're completely innocent, it still costs money to get out from under an accusation.
Mm-hmm.
It can cost a lot of money because, even if you win the case, you don't get your lawyer fees paid.
Yes. Lawyers are not cheap.
No, good ones are even more not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. I think as business owners, we all know.
Yeah. And I'll quote Mike Nicodemus. He always said, it's not if you get sued, it's when. And I always kind of chuckled at that. And until I had a customer, and this wasn't at Raven Plume, it was at CMS, who didn't like the way we did his floor and sued us. And I'm like, the floor is fine. The floor is perfect. And the details are unimportant. But I stuck my heels in and won the case, but paid $40,000 in legal fees. And I could have just given him the $8,000 for the floor in the first place. But I won my case like a dummy.
Yeah, principles matter. Sometimes they cost money too.
Well, they cost a lot.
I don't know, $30,000 principles, but
yeah, my father was not too happy with me over that whole thing.
It makes sense. That's okay though.
Well, if we jump into marketing, what do you think are the most common mistakes you see in funeral home marketing? A lot of what I struggle with, not I personally, but what I struggle with helping, our customers with sometimes is how do you provide value quickly? Because you only get so many seconds now to show value to your customers before they're going to move on to the next person who, is going to struggle with the same thing. So what do you feel like are the most common mistakes?
Funeral service marketing, still to this day, we have a problem understanding who our market is. And we have a very big disadvantage because our market is reduced by the death rate. But we don't know who is going to die in advance for the most part. So we have to market to everybody. And then when we start setting up KPIs and open rates and all that stuff, it's really, the numbers are so small because no one wants to even think about funeral service until they're close to needing it or someone in their immediate circle are close to needing it. So we have to almost over-market for a tiny little market that's really there, but we don't know who that market is, if that makes sense. So one of the things that I've jumped on many years ago, and still to this day, it's not becoming commonplace yet, and you guys probably know this, it's that inbound content-based, give away some of your recipes to everybody, knowing that when and if, even if it's 20 years down the road, they need you, they'll remember and know who you are. And they'll say, oh, that guy told me about the 5 stages of grief, or that guy told me about why his crematory is better, or whatever content that you're putting out there. You've got to do it to everybody. But the numbers don't come back like traditional marketing because it's ignored by most people. So I think that is one of the things that Raven Plume in our marketing vertical, we try and dissuade them from the old, quote, tried and true methods. Like not this past NFDA, but the NFDA before, and where were we? Was it Chicago, I believe. There was a direct marketing company, a mailer, those old, I should say old, but they are old. And I'm like, oh my gosh, there's a direct marketing, direct mail company here. And the lady says, yep, we're still here. We've been tried and true. This method has worked for 45 years. And I just thought, does it still? You know?
Yeah, that's the wrong marketing. It's like, will it work for the next 10? That's the only
No,
question
of
that
course it
matters. Yeah, that's the only question that matters. Yeah.
I'm still on the editorial committee for a magazine that you guys are well, Tyler is in an article, and I saw the proof of it yesterday. And you had talked about how the pandemic almost forced our space to up their game when it comes to technology. And it's sad that it took a pandemic for that to happen. And it's still, are we going to backslide?
Yeah.
Yeah. My comment on that is I do feel that the sentiment is that they are sliding back.
Yeah, me too.
But the consumer sentiment is not going back.
Exactly.
Yeah. What they originally thought was acceptable and they got away with 3-4 years ago, they're not going to get away with it anymore when consumers are used to post-pandemic life with most businesses that had to adapt, and you'll see the ones that aren't.
Absolutely. And that's one thing we forget too. And I think I speak a lot, as you guys know, and one of the core themes through almost all of my presentations is that we used to be the tried and trusted, and what do we do? The consumer looked to us for answers. I know what's best for my families is a common thing that I've heard funeral directors say, and that's been gone for 20 years. But there's so many of those people that still feel they know what's best. That won't work with my families. Well, your families aren't the same as they were 5 years ago, never mind 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And technology changed all that. The internet, instant access to crap information as well. Let's not even discount the fact that there's a lot of bad information out there. That changes everything. And we need to turn into educators, not you need this casket or you need burial because cremation, that's for poor people. Or, I mean, it baffles me.
Yeah. I've always been a proponent of a build long-term credibility and trustworthiness in your business, and you will reap the benefits.
100%.
And it's not hard to convince people of. Yeah.
Telling someone how you are better than them, better than them. You have to use these. These are the tools. And I mean, that's sales 101, if you will.
Sure.
And it never really trickled into funeral service because we were the only ones who did what we do. And, up until the 60s, everyone trusted. But then the 60s changed everything. And then, with the whole funeral rule and Jessica Mitford's book and, the value of funeral service, I mean, we did that to ourselves. I mean, if you guys are too young to remember, funerals were always priced based on the casket. So the casket was this price. And if you got that casket, you got these services.
Oh, wow.
And it just devalued what was truly valuable. No one gave a crap about the box. They cared about the professional service.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're lumping all that stuff into a box and then everyone says, well, gosh, that box only cost you $500, but you're charging me $12,000 for it. Oh, well, all our services are included. Well, they'll pay $1,000 for the box, but then they'll pay the $11 for your services and they'll be happy about it because they see value. But it's almost like the old adage of, if you don't love yourself, how are you going to love someone else? Funeral directors don't see the value in themselves if they can't put it out there to others. And I know that might sound a little harsh, but I've seen it time and time again where my clients have taken all their product prices and brought them down to low margins, cover your overhead and a little bit, and then raise their professional service fees. Your embalming fee shouldn't be $99. And it's worked in every single case. Of my clients, at least.
Wow.
Their numbers have gone way up.
Switching gears a little bit, Larry, I also surfed your website and found a lot of interesting things. And as someone who's worked in crematory and office space housed in the same location, I find the most interesting things that you offer to be on the crematory consulting side, the inspecting consulting side, and the ID and chain of custody side. These are things as funeral directors that are necessary and often get overlooked. And if not necessarily overlooked, do have a tendency to regress, if not consistently checked. So I kind of want to know, what are some of the most common things you see needing improvement on the crematory operations side? And what do you suggest to owners and operators to mitigate those issues? And with those suggestions, what kind of cadence do you suggest funeral home owners implement these suggestions on?
Well, I too find that stuff the most interesting because it's definitely, where my expertise is. And I'm one of those OCD guys, I'm a perfectionist to a fault. And it's one thing to have a great SOP, a standard operating procedure. It's one thing to have perfect policies in place. The problem I have is, like, one of my services at Raven Plume is I can develop customized SOP for a crematory or, an establishment. And we go through the whole process. Sometimes, a lot of times I'll even go out to the site and visit and, interview staff and see what they're doing now and see where, there are gaps. And ID and chain of custody is just a small part of that whole. And then they get the first draft and see that it's 80 pages and they freak out. They're like, well, this is too much. Can you just do a page of bullet points for us? And I'm like, well, yeah, but that's not going to get you to where you want to be. So once we get past that point, we get a final document, and then it doesn't get implemented, or it gets implemented, but it doesn't get enforced, and it's not consistently. And you said cadence. I think you should audit those things at least once a month, even if it's just spot audits. But you've got to write someone up when they make a mistake. We don't hold our employees accountable like we should sometimes because we're compassionate people and they're good people. But when you make a mistake and someone finds out that that mistake was made, and then a plaintiff's attorney who's looking for a new ambulance to chase realizes that there's no DNA in cremated remains, you can't say, I definitely know that I did this, because you didn't do it that way every single time. So the enforcement, the consistency, and holding your people accountable. And that means you may have to fire somebody if they don't do it like it should be done. And it sounds, again, here I go being harsh, but I've seen $1 million settlements. And that is when they didn't even make a mistake. They were just accused of it, but couldn't prove anything. And their insurance company said, okay, we're going to pay out policy maximum to keep this from going to court. Then you're off the hook. But now your insurance just went up 10 times, even if you can get them to redo your policy. So it's consistency and it's enforcement. These documents are living documents. They're not to sit on a shelf. And going back to a central theme, and a lot of my clients, they hire me, they hire one of my other consultants because of our expertise and our knowledge. There's value there, and we do this work, and then they don't like it, so then it sits on the shelf and does nothing. But then they complain and say, well, this happened. Well, did you do this, this, and this like we had put into place? Well, no. So all of that stuff there has to be follow through.
Yeah, I agree. And I see that time and time again. And I do want to say that while the funeral home owner, the managing director, is responsible, I do have a caveat that they are generally overworked and oftentimes maybe not given the time, which is the most important resource they have at their disposal, or other resources to implement whatever SOPs are written. So great idea in theory, execution generally poor. And I acknowledge that it does require a rethinking of how your staff functions and what the actual function of a manager or owner is, and giving them the time to actually manage rather than insert themselves over and over again into the minutia of operations day to day, which I think they find is their comfort zone, and they stay in that comfort zone. But when these things happen, they know that ultimately that is their responsibility, but they didn't get to it. I see it all the time.
It's one of the things I try and perpetuate through this. I have this operating thing that we developed with CANA, the crematory management program, if you will. And one of the core tenets of it is to try and people-proof the business instead of John does this, Bob does that, Larry does this, Tyler does that. We turn everything into competency-based roles with tasks for the role underneath each role, cross-training everybody so that when Tyler, who is fulfilling the role of crematory operator, when he wants to take a vacation, Will can come in because he's cross-trained.
Mm-hmm.
And that fosters critical thinking amongst your employees.
Mm-hmm.
And they can start thinking, okay, well, I have an issue. How am I going to fix it? I've been trained here. I've been trained there. I don't need to call the owner every time something happens and put your hands up.
Right.
And that allows management and ownership to do that. Instead, just like you said, getting it into the weeds of daily operations is counterproductive to all of it.
All of it. Yeah. It's such a choke point. You see it time and time again. Any minor thing, call the owner, call the manager, every small little thing.
Yeah.
And it works, but it will slow you down and leave you open to issues.
Yeah, absolutely.
That you're not expecting. Along similar lines, what guidelines would you suggest to funeral home owners to make sure they're always ready for an inspection?
Well, that's a good one. One of the things that drives me crazy, and I see it a lot, is we do things differently depending on the circumstances. So I had a client that would cremate in a certain alternative container, but if it was a witness, they'd upgrade it. So if the family was coming, regardless of what they purchased, they didn't want to show them in a cardboard box.
Okay.
And I asked them, I said, okay, why would you do that differently only when someone's watching? Because that will filter through the rest of your operation. I'm only going to do this, like maybe do a really good job sweeping out if someone's watching me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So those kinds of things can really, if you get an inspection like an unannounced, you start to scramble. And I always say, do everything the way you do as if the inspector's right there every single minute of when you're on the job. Mm-hmm. And then you don't ever have to worry. Audits of businesses, like when I had CMS and we get an audit notice and my accounting girls would just freak out. And I'm like, why are you freaking out? We do everything by the book. We don't cheat. Nothing that we do could cause us to get in trouble. So I never stressed out about audits.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say the same thing when it comes to being ready for inspections. Act like the inspector's there watching over a CCTV every moment of every day. And you don't have to worry.
Yeah. I even go further and suggest that staff to that level as well. Mm-hmm. So you should be staffing every part of your business as if the inspector is there. If you don't, then there will be cases that inspectors may find that you made exceptions with.
Yep.
So staffing helps there too.
And it all goes back to consistency as well.
Yep.
It's the time to be anal retentive. It's the time to be obsessive compulsive. And you can't understaff. And I get it. We all don't want to spend money that we don't have to. I understand that.
Mm-hmm.
But to be in business and to be effective and successful, we do have to have the people behind us. Because if you overstaff or understaff, they're going to burn out. You're going to burn out. I mean, think about how many funeral directors that are just burned out, especially through the pandemic. That's a whole nother thing we could talk about is, universal precautions and the fact that universal precautions didn't exist before the pandemic and don't anymore now either. We're not treating every decedent like they have every disease. We freaked out and it should have just been a little blip on the radar. Okay, COVID's here. We're not doing anything different because we treat everybody like they're full of everything.
Right.
But we get lazy.
It's true. Again, it's the regression that tends to happen. kind of the third leg of this question is regarding ID and chain of custody, and it's kind of a two-parter. So what are some of the general guidelines for good chain of custody practices for funeral homes? And you can feel free to talk about like any relationships with subcontracted transport companies too in that. And then secondly, what kind of technological developments have you seen in the chain of custody space, and where do they fit in, and how do you implement those?
So thankfully, in the last 10, 12-ish years, the importance of this is becoming more ubiquitous, more common, typical, because there have been these horrible settlements. You don't see them as court cases because they don't make it to court. They don't make it to jury trial. But there's tons of them. And the firms that are not doing it, really, they're few and far between anymore. That can be as basic as just having a piece of paper that travels with the decedent from removal to return of the cremated remains. And every step of the journey is logged and signed and time-stamped so that there's proof that you've looked at the decedent, whether it's an ID tag or it's a toe tag or it's, I looked at the paperwork and it says there's a 98-year-old Caucasian lady and there's a little old white lady in the casket or in the container. I checked that off. There's so many ways, I've certified thousands and thousands of operators across the globe, I guess you could say. And I get this even to this day. We're the crematory operator. We shouldn't be responsible for the identification of the deceased because we don't know what that person is supposed to look like. And I always say that there's so many things that you do know that you can check. In the US, there's race, there's gender, there's height and weight, usually weight for sure. Well, it's 2022. What about someone who's gender fluid? Well, then if there's a question, stop. Mitigate the confusion. That person will still be dead and you'll still be able to cremate them. But why do you have to rush and get all this stuff done? If you have a question, just stop. So when they get that light bulb and they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I should be looking to make sure that the toe tag matches the paperwork, or that if it says there's an African-American woman in the casket or in the container via the paperwork and I open it and it's an Asian man, you need to do some checking. And I think that once that happens, things go so much smoother. And I think that's a light bulb moment for a lot of crematory operators.
I think so too.
Owners don't enforce that like they should a lot of times, but I know I've met so many operators that take their responsibility like that. Once they figure out how important it is, they take it to heart, and they don't realize how important it is.
We would always send paperwork down so that the crematory operator could check name, case number, gender, date of birth, and if all of those meant, that's a lot of aligning data that can give you significant confidence that you're cremating the right person and giving you the willingness to move forward with performing an irreversible service.
Because you can't put them back together again.
Right.
You mentioned technology, and one of the ID tracking platforms that I really like has a pre-cremation checklist that, unless that checklist is completed, you physically cannot scan the QR code to move the decedent into the crematory.
Love that. That's
and
great.
Those things are always on that checklist. Is if I'm developing the checklist, it's exhaustive, but is the authorization present and signed? Is it correct? Little things like, were we supposed to take fingerprints? Have those been taken? Is the burial transit permit present? And these are all things that should never have to be not present at that level, but it's always good to have that last step. And I even have clients, and I'll give credit to a client out in South Carolina that used to work for FPG, who, I can tell you his name is Justin Baxley, and he had in his home that he sold to FPG back in the day a final phone call to the funeral director in charge. The operator's required to make that last chance phone call and say, hey, funeral director, I am getting ready to cremate Mr. John Smith. Is there any reason why I can't proceed? And the funeral director blesses it.
Right.
And I said, well, I love the idea. I think it's wonderful, but does it slow them down? And he said, absolutely not. They will push back at first because it's a 30-second slowdown. But
Sure,
30
sure.
seconds in the grand scheme of things, you can do that while the unit's preheating.
Right.
Instead of checking your Twitter, make your last chance phone call.
So I have some comments on that. One thing that we did was we had a specific role in the funeral home that looked through every single file prior to cremation and databased all the necessary cremation log information prior to the cremation in an Excel spreadsheet, and a final check of all the authorizations, and then a cover sheet that would attest to that audit, and that would go down to the crematory as well. And that was extremely helpful and saved us a lot of headache and issues. And then secondly, which is something that I recommend to every funeral home in the world, would be every single day, make a list of who is in your storage unit and refrigeration unit and audit that with your yesterday's list and who you have coming in-house that day or should be on the way. And do that every single day. Because if there's any mismatch and someone's there that shouldn't be or not there that should be, you get that right at that time and not 3 days later when the death certificate's filed and the cremation's ready to take place.
Exactly. And you can keep track. That's such a great idea. And it's above and beyond your regular, but it doesn't take that long. And I always, even for high volume, like I have a client in Washington that does probably 7,000 cremations a year. It's ridiculous. And needless to say, they have hundreds of people in storage on any given day in their cold storage facility.
Yep.
But every rack, every decedent has a number, and every day they know who's in spot A43. And they double check it, just like you said, and it mitigates so many potential problems. And that policy alone can almost eliminate any doubt that a decedent's family would have that there would be a mix-up.
Absolutely.
You know, little things like, I always say, I don't care how busy you are, how many units you have, one set of unsealed, packaged, cremated remains in the room at a time. So if you sweep someone out of unit 1 and they need to cool, you need to wait before you sweep unit 2, even if unit 2 is ready, until you process and package. Well, I know they're not getting switched, but your word is nothing when you're sitting in a deposition and you've got someone could switch those tags or someone could do something nefarious, right? And you have no choice but to say yes, because it could happen. So that's another big gap. That
even further to your point, having those strict procedures and consistency can prevent, and I have seen it prevent, lawsuits. If you communicate to a customer or their lawyer your process, and after that communication, they're like, oh, they have it sealed up tight.
Yeah, we're not going to prove
we're not going to pursue. Yeah, we're not going to pursue this. Or rather, they are less likely to do so. So you can mitigate just by having a airtight SOP that you adhere to.
It has to be adhered to, and it has to be enforced. Yep. Going back to your other point there. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on a little bit. Let's say I wanted to build a crematory. I'm a licensed funeral director, and I wanted to get into business for myself, and I want to keep everything in-house. I want to be able to tell my families that as soon as your loved one is in our care, they don't go anywhere until they go home with you. So we need our own crematory. Can you explain what the process is like to finding a crematory space and getting it permitted for cremation?
Do we have a week?
And then I'm going to ask you how long it should take. So,
well, just figuring out, and it's such a process.
Mm-hmm.
And it depends obviously on your state, where you live. And, like in California, you've got not only zoning issues, but you've got air districts. The air districts like Bay Area can be different than San Diego Air District.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got to navigate all of the administrative part of it, which can be very cumbersome. We had, this was, maybe 5 years ago, a pet unit going into Benicia. And how we got it zoned in Benicia, I'll never understand, but we found a beautiful property that was zoned by right. Crematory was, so we didn't even have to get a variance or anything.
Oh, wow.
The air district came in and said, well, this crematory, which it was a standard, one of the most popular units, they required a health risk assessment that wanted to test for things like chromium. I'd never heard of such a thing in my life. So they ended up getting shut down. So with that question, I always tell my clients or anyone inquiring on how to do this, be prepared to be disappointed, because most of these get shut down before they even get off. Zoning, if you have to get a variance, can be very difficult.
Yeah.
People come out of the woodwork. There's so much ignorance about cremation. I've seen zoning boards turned down because a lady said her aunt died in the Holocaust and she didn't want to be reminded of that. I've heard of one that I was involved with where a nursing home was next to the proposed multi-million-dollar beautiful funeral establishment. And the lady testified in the hearing that she didn't want to look out her kitchen window and be reminded of her ultimate demise, and denied.
Wow.
The good news on the air quality stuff is that all the machines built today from any of the reputable manufacturers, and there really isn't any unreputable manufacturers, they all meet or exceed any strict air quality. I mean, the federal government doesn't even regulate cremation because it's such a low source of emissions. When you hear about black smoke coming out of a crematory or, pollution, it's always either a poorly maintained or a poorly operated unit. And it's mostly the operator, sadly to say. So you need good staff. You need someone to buy into that whole responsibility thing. So if you can get past zoning, air quality other than California, sorry.
It's okay.
And it's not that California can't, but it's a little harder.
Yeah, we did it, but it took a lot.
It's governmental stuff. I mean, it's always difficult. Right. There's like Pennsylvania has a lot of rules, but you make sure all your T's are crossed and your I's are dotted, and it's a rubber stamp once you get there.
Right.
Cali is really the only place I've seen where they kind of move the goalpost when they want to. And your manufacturer always is going to be the resource. They are the ones who know how to navigate that kind of stuff. When I had the manufacturing company, I testified in many zoning board deals. And, I like to say that I had a lot of success, but the ones you think are going to be slam dunk, someone comes out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
And, it could be as simple as the guy who owns the property next door wants the property that you're trying to buy. So he's going to oppose the crematory so that you can't buy it. And I've seen that multiple times.
Yeah.
And it's just frustrating. It's hard enough to buy a house or any regular business, but when it comes to, the stigma of death, I've seen so many ignorant things. Black smoke coming out of the unit. I've seen a fire chief tell a news reporter, and it's on YouTube. You can probably find it, and I won't tell you where it is, but the initials are Cortez. The fire chief said, yeah, I can confirm that smoke is human remains. And I'm like, it's carbon vapor. It's black carbon. That's it. There's no human part of it. It's 99% from the fuel, but there's so much ignorance.
Wow. And they're willing to comment, which, is kind of
Well,
beyond me,
and I don't know this guy's story or anything, but maybe he needed a peacock moment, and
maybe. Yeah, what can you do? It's all right. And that's why we make the podcast, so that we can educate people.
Get the real information out there.
So how much do you think setting up a crematory would cost prior to retorts and then maybe with retorts?
Well, prior to retorts, it's just going to depend on the area. Obviously, property is going to be different, say in Bay Area, than it would be in Nebraska.
Sure.
Yeah. So you could go from, $50,000 for a plot of land to $50 million, depending on how fancy you want the crematory or, whatever kind of business model you're going to do. Bare basics, I think you could get away with, a small, even just a metal building.
Mm-hmm.
So you could do it for a couple $100,000, I would say, depending on, how much it costs you for zoning. And it's not just the zoning application. If you have to hire somebody to help you with that zoning,
right.
I have a client in New Jersey that had to hire an attorney to navigate everything. Even the manufacturer wasn't able to. Some of the older states, if you will, some of their rules, and especially East Coast, they're just a lot more involved.
Mm-hmm.
So there might be costs.
Could have put it.
I would recommend either a lawyer or someone who has has worked with the city on permitting things like this.
Yep.
And that becomes your local, that's your guy. We had a guy that helped us a lot through that. And he's like, they know where the pushback's going to come, how to handle pushback. And that ultimately helps you just kind of get through it a bit quicker and not necessarily react as much to pushback that you get, and ultimately get your rubber stamp. So be willing to kind of pay for that.
Yeah. And especially a lot of times when the manufacturer says, yes, we'll do this for you, no charge. A lot of times I've seen revolt from the boards, the city councils or whomever's making the decisions, because they don't want to listen to the manufacturer, because the manufacturer is going to get a sale out of it. So right. I've heard one say, you're going to get a sale, so how do I know you're not lying? I'm like, well, because I'm not a liar. I've done this hundreds of times. But there's going to be money involved in that. The retorts, I've been out of that game for a while, but I would say minimum of 120,000 for a basic retort and some of the ancillary, like a processor, loading device. And then you can go as high as, I think probably one of the more expensive units would be one of the European style units.
Like a facultative.
And they go for about, under 300.
Mm-hmm.
And then their ancillary can be as high as another 100. Loading device can be maybe 40 grand, 50 grand. Same thing for the processor. So maybe
that's right.
300 to 400,000 for the higher end, high capacity, high volume, don't need to cool it down in between cremation units. Yeah. What did you run in Omega?
Hartwick.
Pete?
Yeah, Pete.
Yeah. Haven't talked or heard from him in so long.
Yeah. I like Pete. I mean, he's all I ever knew.
Yeah.
I liked his style.
Yeah, he's a good guy. Nothing negative to say. Well, I don't say negative about most people, but Pete always, anytime I've ever come across, whether we're servicing his units or he's servicing ours, always been positive.
Yeah, I agree. I like Pete a lot. He's a good guy.
Awesome.
All right, Larry. So I want to open a crematory, my own cremation brand, not in New York and not in California. I can get land. So on top of that, I'm going to need 600,000 and 6 months to a year.
I don't know if you'll need 600. The last business plan I did was just under 4. Did not include the property though. So it was putting up the building, the unit, everything that was involved. Time frame, supply chain issues, they're all over the place. I've seen there's one manufacturer that actually had a few in stock that they could ship out within a month. Then I've also heard of other manufacturer that was shipping units without the burners because the burners were back ordered by months and months. So they would basically get the unit in place. And when the burners showed up, the startup technician would install the burners at the same time.
Wow.
And those guys were running at about a year to get from order to startup.
Wow.
Back in my day, it was a 90-day deal. You put your deposit down in 90 days, barring any weirdness, we'd deliver your machine and get you going. But
Wow.
COVID changed that a lot with a lot of the supply chain stuff.
Yeah, it did. At various stages, various parts of the business too.
Yeah, and different, like burners one quarter, and then the next quarter, the computer programming modules.
Yeah.
Maybe they were back ordered from wherever they come. And, it's, I think another big issue, and I don't think anyone really talks about it, is the people are putting in crematories a lot more now than they had been 5 years ago. And I think the manufacturers were ill-equipped for that increase in orders. Someone who would do 70, 80 units in a year, all of a sudden is doing 150. And that's massive when it comes to manufacturing on that volume. You've got labor issues to deal with. You've got, cash flow, because you've got to buy all the stuff to put them all together. And, so I think not only supply chain, but just the influx of orders.
Yeah, it makes total sense.
So that's a big investment in both time, planning, and money.
Yeah.
But it's rewarding at the end. I mean, once you're up and running, I've never had a client that I've helped through that whole process say, I wish I wouldn't have done this. I always get God, this was a long road, but I'm sure glad I did it. And it was worth the wait, or it was worth the extra money, or, that kind of thing. It's so busy right now for me that I've had to stop taking clients that want to start crematories that aren't already in the space, because they're so much more labor intensive for us, because we have to educate them on the space as well. And, it goes back to what we were saying about, listening. They hire us and pay us good money for our expertise and our advice. And then they disagree with it and say, no, we're going to do it our way anyway. And then they come back saying, this didn't work. Can you help us? And, and it turns into a lot of wasted time. And I had to stop it. And it's sad, because I don't think only professionals in the space, there's room for other people, but I can't be the one to help them today. Maybe next week.
You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Oh, Will, that is so good. And I wish I would have thought of it, but it's exactly right.
I mean, my favorite line is "my people." Like, my people do this. My people know this. My people want this. And we've run into it.
I had a client. He was completely out of the space. Wanted a business plan, wanted a marketing survey, wanted all this, wanted all that, got everything for him, and didn't like it, and brought in another guy that he's worked with who builds hair salons. And the guy's telling me, well, when I do it's this way, and with it's that way. And I said, well, all due respect, this is not a hair salon. It's completely black versus white here. We're yellow and you're purple. And they just couldn't understand that. And that actual client was the one that triggered me to say, okay, I can't educate and help these guys if they're not going to drink the water.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think the profession itself has been very secretive. I don't think people have been always forthcoming and collaborative with information amongst each other. Yeah. And so I think there is an innate built-in resistance to adhering to what they've traditionally done, because they've had to build that to survive in the past. And so now we're kind of in this situation where information is more free-flowing, so people should be a little bit more collaborative and open to seeing what others are doing, because things are changing pretty quickly now versus when they were 20 years ago.
But, Tyler, I agree with you. I just don't know why. Collaboration amongst peers and amongst like-minded, I think of the success of WeWork, co-working spaces, and you could have 5 or 6 different startups that are similar, all working in the same space, and they're all working with each other to help each other. Why wouldn't we do that in our space?
I have a lot of comments there. I'd say biggest difference between WeWork and Funeral Space is those startups at WeWork, while they're all startups, they might not all be doing the same thing, and they're probably not direct competition. I think in the funeral space, you have a lot of sole proprietors who have difficulty removing their own ego and like value as humans from the business savvy necessary to listen to people that are trying to help you. And ultimately, I think that they get in their own way a lot, unfortunately. And it's not all the time. It's certainly not all the time. But I think in really important phases of business growth, it happens. And I think that's to their own detriment a lot of the time.
Yeah. I have a blog draft that I haven't finished, and I'm hesitant to finish it, but the title of it is Check Your Ego at the Door. And it goes right along with what you were saying. And now I kind of want to finish it. But it always amazes me how an ego issue is in direct correlation with insecurity as well.
And I don't want to like diss any owners or operators or anything like that. My point is FPG and SCI check their egos and they make the changes and decisions necessary to adapt to what their clients want. And I don't want to see sole proprietors, the gap between what FPG firms and SCI firms offer and sole proprietors widen. I don't want that gap to widen because of some individuals' inability to make changes or get used to change.
Right. And it all boils down to just what you said. It's ego, insecurity, paranoia, and fear. I guess our space really isn't any different than any other situation, except we have the added emotional side of it.
Right.
And I'd say, what's the quote? And I forget the person who it's attributed to, but society is judged on how they treat their dead. And I think that to the core is true. We perform a service that every single human being on this planet is going to need. And is there value in that, or is funeral service turning into nothing but waste disposal? I don't think it will ever be just waste disposal, but I don't know that funeral service profession as it is today or as it was in 1960 is going to be anything close to what it becomes in 2040 or 2075.
Yeah. Well, at the end of this, we have a question for you.
We're going to get there.
But for now, switching gears a little bit, what are some of the newest trends in death care that you are seeing that you think are exciting or are up and coming?
Newest trends? Well, that's a good question, because really there's not a lot of new. If someone, and I'm not, because I don't need to kiss butt here, but the newest thing is really you guys, right? Parting Pro. I mean, you were the first, and still, and I'm not promoting, I'm not kissing butt here, but really, who else is there that does that effectively? Nobody. And it's still new. You know, you guys have not penetrated the market like you should have. It's taken a lot longer, but it's still an exciting thing. And, well, that's a fad. Do you see every person under 50 years old, what they do when they're on the subway? They're on their phone.
Yeah.
They're not talking to their neighbors. They're online. I mean, Amazon is worth how many hundreds of billions of dollars? It's just common sense.
Yeah.
So you say new and exciting. I think the trends in technology for tracking and identification, I think, are great. I think, we're talking about a space where the typewriter is still used in some places. And they can't understand why that's not okay.
No. Or physical fax machines rather than e-fax. That took me 7 years to get implemented in my
7 years.
7, yeah. And it was only basically forced on us because we switched phone systems. And then everyone's like, oh, wow, this is easy. And I was like, yeah, it's been easy for 7 years.
That just blows me away.
Yeah. Again, it's just a stubbornness or lack of bandwidth mentally to see a problem, analyze a problem, think critically about it, find the solution, implement a solution, and then stay on top of its execution.
Yeah.
That's a huge gap.
There's so many innovations that are trying to poke their head up and get out of the pool, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know who are going to be successful. And you guys, you see it every day. You're one of the OG, if you will, funeral tech startups. I mean, you see these companies now like Gather and Tulip, and there's 100 of them now. And it's still up in the air as to who's going to rise, if you will. Right. There's a lot of money. Mm-hmm. I do think the online arranging is going to explode if it hasn't already started.
It has. I think it has.
Trends from the pandemic have changed.
Yeah. It is a paradigm shift.
Yeah. And it's sad that it did take, like I said before, take a global pandemic to get people to realize. And, there's still value in talking to someone. There's still value in the hand holding, and there's still value in that human touch. But you know what? If I'm going to order a new suitcase, I'm not going to go to a salesman. I'm going to go to Amazon. And I hate that because I hate Jeff Bezos.
That's fair. That's fair assessment. You're fine. That's cool.
Oh, but it's what's happening.
I totally agree with you. And Tyler and I talk about this. What I think is that, like, if I take Parting Pro and just use one example of the tools that it offers, e-signing forms with embedded email. I would think about prior to Parting Pro, how many times I opened up my Microsoft Outlook after talking with a family, entered their email, entered a subject line, wrote a draft message to extend my condolences, recap what our conversation, attach paperwork and a GPL, and then send. That's 2.5 to 4 minutes, 20 times a day.
Yep.
And Parting Pro built it in their software and built the sending and retrieval of those signed documents in there as well. Saves me work weeks over a decade.
100%.
Work weeks. And it allows me to spend more time giving that family this empathy and sympathy that I know I can give them and that I deem as my value and my role. My role is not to be a software engineer or to be an email expert. It's to help families. So exactly. Use tools that can help you do that.
I was just going to say, my dad said it for years and years. You got to have the right tool for the job.
Yep.
And I'll switch gears. I just thought of another wonderful thing, another parting thing. And full transparency, I am on their board. But Parting Stone, to me, is just such an exciting new way to memorialize somebody that's been cremated. And I love that. I hope, and I think they will be lasting. I mean, they've really cemented themselves into the space now. I think Justin Crow's done an incredible job of branding and marketing. And you need the right product as well. And it's not that it's a product, it's a service. But I think that's probably another standout for me, even if I wasn't part of that company. Full transparency. I'm not trying to promote it.
I mean, they definitely are doing something that's completely different. And like when you see it, you're like, oh, this is not something that looks like anything else anyone's ever done. So it's really interesting to see things like that.
Well, did you see the new data that CANA put out on the new surveys that they did with Harris on cremated remains, disposition of cremated remains, containers? And I haven't been able to deep dive into it, but I really want to look and see how that reflects the parting stones of the world and, those plastic boxes that there are millions of in people's closets. And
yeah.
I'm a guy that, like, my mom is right there in a big, beautiful stainless steel lotus flower urn thing that there's a whole story behind that as well. I couldn't imagine leaving her in a plastic box, never mind leaving her at the crematory, which happens, as you know.
Yep.
And it's like, God, I don't think I'm different than most people. So I think maybe that is why I really like Parting Stone, because it gives another avenue for that kind of not putting mom in the closet.
Yeah. I appreciate all the kind words, guys. You didn't really have to.
You earned it.
But,
You totally earned it, man. Yeah.
Exactly.
No, but in general, we are kind of like of that OG class. I mean, there's been so many that have come after us. And I think the one thing that we were able to really navigate this space was you have to have patience, because it is not going to be something that everyone adopts tomorrow, even if we did have the greatest product, which I'm not claiming, but like, even if you had the greatest product that solved every need in the funeral home, getting it to everyone and for them to be welcoming of new technologies and new companies is a really slow process within death care. I think for us, we've had to slog through that first 3 or 4 years to be at the shows, to build up a network and to build up relationships for anyone to even trust you to make that leap. And I think that's what happens when all these new companies come in. They could have the greatest product, but it's not something that's just going to explode overnight.
No.
You're going to see 30% of the industry using it tomorrow. It just doesn't happen in this industry.
No, it's molasses compared with other spaces.
Yeah.
And I think you and I and Alex may have talked about that 4 or 5 years ago when you guys were first coming around. How long have you been around now? The pandemic screws with my timeline. So
I think, we had our other products back in 2015, so we're coming up on 7, almost 8 years
that
now.
Makes sense. That makes sense.
And it really felt like we hit a groove maybe 4 years ago. Was when we felt like, okay, we can open these conversations.
But you didn't give up. That's one of the
iterated.
things that I was going to bring up, is even talking with you guys before the iteration of Parting Pro. So many people have a great idea and then may not have the best idea for the time, and then they go away. You guys didn't go away. And the Eric Newhouses of the world, he's still around. He had a great idea back in the day. I helped him with his original idea, and didn't work out. It was a great idea, but he's still around. And I love that.
Yeah.
And,
he's found success now. What he's doing.
Yeah. And I think that, the perseverance and the don't give up attitude, and that translates to everything, really, from the operator to the funeral director to the student, the mortuary student. It's just part of life.
And I'm hoping to as we start to develop a more transparent and collaborative, environment, that new technologies, new things will spread faster amongst colleagues and people, because I feel like now, we're getting into that where people will share, whereas before, once you found something you liked, you try not to tell anybody because you want to be the only one that has it. And so I think collaboration will allow us to spread better ideas quicker amongst the people that are willing to listen.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can use eSign to have an NDA executed.
One step forward, 2 steps back.
There you go.
Yeah. Larry, you have, switching gears again, you had Cremation Strategies and Consulting, and now that's Raven Plume Consulting.
Yeah, Cremation Strategies and Raven Plume are both the same company. They're both the same EIN. So they're DBAs. I do keep the brand Cremation Strategies because of the relationship that we have with CANA. And I'm a member benefit, if you will. Members can get 30 minutes of consultation free with Cremation Strategies. Raven Plume, I changed the name or added the brand just so that it wasn't so cremation centric, because I do have an embalming restorative art, Ben Schmidt. I don't know if you guys know Ben. He taught at Worsham for years. He's now at North Texas Community College. He's a restorative art. He's written a textbook, an embalming textbook that's being used in mortuary schools. I've got 2, I don't want to say rural funeral directors, but they're pretty rural funeral directors, but they're also podcast hosts. Ryan and Brian from Undertaking the Podcast are also Raven Plume consultants, and they focus more on arranging and funeral directing. And Ryan actually does, he's got this little mini session that he can do for funeral homes that are being acquired, because his family firm was just in the last 2 years acquired by a small conglomerate, and he navigated that as one of the sons of, well, his uncle and his dad were the owners. So he was in a unique perspective to, to go through that transition. And there's a lot of that going on right now. So, and to HR generalists, we've had so much questions about how to keep staff, how to get staff, how to have staff that comply. So one of my best friends in the world here in Tulsa, she and her husband both are HR gurus. In fact, her husband is the CHRO of Bank of Oklahoma, which is a $55 billion bank, and they know HR. So she said, you know what, I'll help you out. And her and another gal named Martha, they've taken off. It's just been kind of crazy because funeral service has always been easily staffed, but it's not the case anymore.
No.
We can't find people, and if we find them, then we can't find good people, and then we can't keep them because they keep getting recruited out. And we're a space now that, we've been insulated from that for a long time. But those days are over.
Homes. Yep, you have to think about employee retention. You have to.
Yeah. So that's why Raven Plume came about. In the marketing side of it, I have a graphic design and advertising. He's an advertising designer, is what his degree is in. Far more talented than I'll ever be when it comes to that kind of stuff. But between him and then me knowing the space as well as I do, we can do everything from logo design to branding from the ground up to, even just helping you with strategic planning and basic stuff like that.
That's great. You offer a full suite of consulting services for funeral homes.
Pretty much for the funeral space. Yeah. It's 100% death care related.
Yeah.
I've have clients that own other types of businesses that have wanted help with their other verticals. And I'm like, no, we're loyal to our fan base, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. As you should be.
Well, I don't want to drive outside of my lane. That always gets us in trouble.
It has a tendency to, yeah. So, Larry, we have our culminating question for our podcast has been the same, and we like to kind of keep it as a staple so that we can get different perspectives on the same question, regardless of the nature of the guest. So, what does death care look like in 10 years?
Oh, that's a great question. From my perspective, I think death care is going to be transformed due to technology. And I don't mean just technology like computer stuff. I'm talking disposition methods. I'm talking the ways we communicate. You see all these new alkaline hydrolysis, which isn't really that new, but it's now becoming a little bit more, I don't want to say mainstream, but the public actually know about it now. Natural organic reduction. There's been Promessa, which, we could go on another hour and talk about the freeze-dried decedents. It's basically not happening, but I think that we'll have technology when it comes to disposition methods that change. Some will be good, some will be, are you kidding me? Mm-hmm. And I think communication. And there's always going to be the folks that want to do our job from the outside and, kind of knock traditional funeral service. And really, what is traditional funeral service? Is embalming going to stay around? I absolutely think it's going to stay around. There's still value for some people that have that viewing and have that experience. So I just think there's going to be a lot more variety, and it's all going to be based on technology.
Cool. Yeah, I agree.
Great.
I agree. We've gotten a lot of unique perspectives. You touched on a lot of common themes that we've heard from a lot of folks. So yeah.
So I'm not an outlier then.
No,
I usually am.
No.
I'm usually way out left field with stuff.
I think we tend to bring on people that would be considered out of left field, but that's kind of our jam.
And I love it, because I'll tell you, what did someone tell me the other day? You're always good for an opinion, Larry. This is true.
So if we're not seeing you at the next show, or if we don't catch you there, where can we find you? Do you want to share your website, socials, email, all that stuff?
Oh, yeah. So Raven Plume, if you go to the moniker Raven Plume CONS, so Raven Plume Cons, for consulting. You can find us on Twitter. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook. Yeah, I'm old enough to still use Facebook. And you can always go to Larry Stuart Jr. for Junior, and it's Stuart Jr. For my personal Facebook, Twitter, Insta. I'm not really good at Instagram. I think there's an age gap. Ben keeps trying to show me how to do reels and, all this other stuff. And I'm like, I just don't get it. Facebook's so much easier.
And then it's ravenplume.com.
Ravenplume.com. And if you go, my old URL is cremationstrategy.com, you'll actually redirect to ravenplume.com. It's an interesting story about where we came up with the name Raven Plume. I encourage viewers and listeners to, if you do anything, just read that little snippet on the page. I'm kind of proud of the irony in the name, and because plume is a feather, but could be something else that we don't want, especially when it comes to cremation.
All right. Well, thank you very much for sharing your expertise today. I think we covered a lot of valuable topics and a lot of takeaways that can be implemented today if people want to listen.
I appreciate the invitation. I was really excited to come on. So I'm glad that we were able to make it work time-wise. And I look forward to seeing you guys hopefully at the next show. I don't know when the next one is. Probably the CANA Symposium in Vegas. Will you guys be there?
Oh, we'll be there.
Yeah.
Awesome. You're speaking.
Yeah.
I knew that.
I thought you were teeing us up. I thought you were teeing us up on the slot.
That's right. I was, Will. That's exactly it.
Oh, thank you.
What are you going to talk about?
Oh, geez. Are we going to be there? Cool. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see you there.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be in the front row for sure.
Perfect. Actually, you sit in the back. You don't need to hear us. You sit in the back. There's some other guests that I think really need to be in the front row.
I get it. I do. I get it. Well, I'll be there for moral support for sure.
Appreciate you.
I'll be definitely wearing my choir robe because.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. This was great. Everyone, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Larry.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you ever want to know more, please find us at directcremation.com.